My name is Evan Cole, 41, from Clearwater, Florida. I ran a small home renovation company with 2 crews and a reputation for finishing jobs on time. After 12 days in the Caribbean sunburnt shoulders, sand buried in the seams of our suitcases, my wife, Lila, our 8-year-old daughter, and I rolled into our driveway at dusk, ready to sleep in our own beds. The porch light, which I'd left on a timer, was dark. I told myself the bulb had blown. Then I saw the splinters at the jam-fresh wood curled like fingernail shavings along the threshold. I pressed my palm to the deadbolt. It wobbled. Somebody had pried the lock straight through the strike plate. The contractor part of me noticed the tool marks, first thin, parallel scoring, flat bar and wedge, not brute force. Someone who knew what they were doing, inside. Our living room looked like a storm had learned how to make choices. Drawers were emptied, but only the ones that mattered. Couch cushions were slashed along the seams, not hacked at random. In my office, files lay gutted across the floor, but the cheap stuff cordless drill, tablet sat untouched. The safe in the hall closet was open on its back like a turtle, the keypad faceplate neatly popped off and set down beside it. "Evan," Lila whispered. "The cameras." We had 2 visible bullet cams at the front eaves and a small dome under the porch awning, plus a hidden battery cam tucked inside a bookshelf speaker, my own paranoid addition after a job last spring. Every visible lens had been cracked with a precise center punch tap. The DVR cabinet was gone. The router ports had been unplugged, not yanked. The cables were coiled and set on the shelf like a store display. Whoever came in had time and confidence. I moved room to room, cataloging damage without touching anything. Years of measuring twice and cutting once bled into how I took stock mental checklists, angles, sequences. Lila took our daughter to the neighbors for hot chocolate and calm voices. I stood alone in the office, listening to the clock in the kitchen tick too loudly in a house that didn't feel like ours. There's a particular smell a house has after it's been searched by strangers: sweat, torn paper, dust lifted out of long, undisturbed corners. I pushed open the lowest drawer of my desk and felt the absence before I saw it. The heirloom wooden box was gone, the one my father had built from old walnut floorboards, with finger joints so tight you could barely see the seams. Inside, I kept the deed and survey copies for our property and a notarized affidavit tied to an old easement that the HOA had argued about for 2 years. Also inside, wrapped in felt, was my father's silver pocket watch, engraved with his initials, the spring still strong after 40 years. I said nothing about the box to anyone, not then, not in the first chaotic minutes. I knew better than to shout details in front of gawkers. Insurance required a clean list. The police would want first impressions untainted. I took out a notepad, wrote in block letters, and slipped it into my back pocket. By the time Lila came back, the cul-de-sac had formed a semicircle at our curb, Curiosity in flip-flops. Among them stood Marjorie Hale, 55, HOA treasurer, all crisp linen and controlled eyebrows. She was the kind of neighbor who turned sympathy into a performance fingers pressed to a collarbone. A voice pitched just loud enough to be overheard. "Oh, Evan," she said, stepping over the threshold without waiting. "What an awful welcome home." "It is," I said, keeping my body between her and the office. "We're still taking stock." She glanced around, eyes moving faster than her face. "These criminals," she tutted. "If only everyone would follow the HOA's security guidelines. We emailed a list before the holiday. You received it? We got it." I'd read her list: decorative bushes trimmed below window level, camera placement visible from the street, alarm signage standardized. It was theater with bullet points. Neighbors murmured condolences. Someone set a casserole on the console as if grief was a potluck. Marjorie drifted toward the hall closet and paused at the safe, its empty mouth open to the ceiling. She made a sympathetic sound that landed like a diagnosis. "People take anything they can flip," she said, small, portable, sentimental. Jewelry, Watches. Her gaze flicked to the office door. A silver pocket watch would be irresistible. I felt the floor drop a fraction, the way it does when an elevator starts moving and your stomach learns the building is not as still as it pretends. Lila's eyes cut to mine. We had not told anyone about the box. We had not told anyone about the watch. I had not even written it on the notepad yet. I haven't said what's missing, I replied, keeping my tone flat. Why would you say that? Marjorie blinked, then smiled the way people smile when they realize a sentence has walked farther than they intended? Oh, you know, she said lightly. Just speaking generally, people keep those heirlooms. My father had one. She tapped her wrist, as if pocket watches lived there. I nodded as if I believed her. I didn't. My eyes went to the porch awning where the small dome camera used to be, and then to the shelf where the router had been disconnected. Cables coiled. Whoever did this knew our rhythms, our systems, our blind spots. Someone had watched us load our suitcases. Someone had learned the timing of our lights. Someone had known exactly what to break and what to leave. I walked her back to the door, as polite as a bouncer. Outside, the sky bruised toward night. Lila wrapped an arm around our daughter on the neighbor's steps. I reached into my pocket and unfolded the notepad. On a blank line between DVR cabinet and desk drawer contents, I wrote, in careful letters, heirloom box deeds, easement, father's silver pocket watch. I hadn't told a soul about the watch. So how did Marjorie know to name it? The police arrived within an hour, lights washing the cul-de-sac in red and blue. Officers moved through the house, gloved hands lifting debris with more care than the thieves had shown. They asked questions in a steady rhythm when we'd left. Who had keys? Whether anyone had known we were away. I answered, while Lila held our daughter on the neighbor's porch. Whispering reassurances, she didn't quite believe herself. I explained the camera system, the smashed lenses, the missing DVR. One officer crouched near the hall closet, studying the open safe. No force damage on the keypad, he muttered. Someone knew how to bypass electronics. The second officer flipped through his clipboard. Looks targeted. Did you tell anyone about valuables in the house? No, I said. We don't advertise our business. From across the lawn, Marjorie Hale hovered like a stage director between acts. Her linen blouse caught the rotating lights, flashing pale each time the cruiser's bar swept by. She spoke to clusters of neighbors, her hands cutting the air in decisive shapes. Even here, in someone else's misfortune, she seemed to hold a meeting. When the officers asked about suspicious vehicles, one neighbor mentioned a dark SUV idling near our driveway 2 nights earlier. Marjorie laughed it off. Half the neighborhood drives black SUVs. That proves nothing. Her voice carried, sharp enough that the officer frowned at her interference. I kept silent, but my mind replayed her earlier slip, the mention of the pocket watch, a detail I had told no one, not even the officers yet. The weight of it pressed behind my ribs. The police took notes, promised follow-up, and left us with the sour aftertaste of helplessness. Their taillights vanished around the corner, leaving the night quieter than it should have been. Neighbors drifted back inside. Only Marjorie lingered, folding her arms. You'll want to file with insurance quickly, she advised, her tone more command than sympathy. The board expects residents to handle claims promptly. Delays complicate community records. I stared at her. The board has no say in my insurance. Her lips twitched. Everything that touches this neighborhood touches the board. Evan, don't forget that. She turned and walked away, heels clicking against the concrete, echoing like punctuation marks I couldn't ignore. Inside, Lila stood in the doorway of our daughter's room, staring at the stuffed animals thrown from the bed. They touched everything, she whispered, even her toys. Her voice cracked, and something in me tightened like a knot pulled hard. I sat at the kitchen table, spreading out what papers the thieves had left behind. Most of the renovation contracts were scattered but untouched. But the drawer where I kept the easement documents, the ones tied to HOA property lines, was empty. Not just the originals in the box, even the copies I had kept separately were gone. It wasn't burglary for profit, it was precision. Someone wanted records erased. I scribbled on my notepad documents tied to HOA property lines missing. The list grew darker the longer I wrote. Lila leaned over my shoulder. Why would anyone care about those? Because they challenge the board's control over land behind our property, I said quietly. Without them, the HOA can claim the strip as theirs. Her eyes widened. You think this was about the HOA? I remembered Marjorie's glance toward the closet, her casual naming of the watch, her insistence that the board had a stake in my insurance. Every word felt less like coincidence and more like rehearsal. I walked back to the porch, staring at the coiled cables where the DVR used to sit. The night air carried faint traces of perfume, sharp and expensive, the same she always wore to meetings. In my chest, dread braided with anger. This wasn't a random break-in. It was a message, delivered with surgical precision. Someone close, someone who believed they were untouchable, had stepped across my threshold and rifled through my life. And if I was right, they weren't finished. I barely slept that night. Each creak of the house felt like an intruder still hiding in the walls. At dawn, I brewed coffee strong enough to mask exhaustion and walked the perimeter of my yard. The splintered frame on the front door seemed louder in daylight, as if announcing to the entire street that I'd failed to protect my family. Neighbors waved politely from driveways, but their eyes lingered too long, pity mixed with suspicion. Word spreads fast in a community like ours. By morning, I wasn't just Evan who ran a renovation company, I was the man who couldn't safeguard his own home. At 9 sharp, Marjorie appeared again. She carried a clipboard like always, as though neighborhood disasters were items to be checked off. She clucked her tongue at the broken door. Evan, dear, the board needs an incident report. Transparency is essential for community stability. I steadied my voice. Police already have the report. This isn't about police, she replied smoothly. Residents deserve reassurance that leadership is handling matters. The board must evaluate whether additional security assessments are required. Funny, I said. Since my cameras were destroyed, maybe the board should worry about who knew exactly where they were. Her smile flickered. Paranoia doesn't suit you. People talk when they hear that tone. I noted how she sidestepped the point. I also noticed the faint smudge of dirt along her sleeve, out of place against her pristine blouse. It looked like the same dust that clung to the closet safe after the thieves pried it open. I tucked the observation away without comment. Later that afternoon, the insurance adjuster arrived. As I walked him through the house, I kept details about the wooden box and the watch to myself. Something told me those items were too important to share loosely. When he left, I returned to the office and locked the door. I opened my laptop and dug into digital backups. Thankfully, I had scanned many records, but not all. The most sensitive deed copies proof that the HOA had overreached property boundaries were gone. Only the physical originals, once housed in that box, carried legal weight. Without them, the board could push their agenda unchecked. The realization hit hard. Someone wanted those documents silenced, and robbing my home was their chosen method. That evening, while Lila tried to maintain normalcy with dinner, our daughter asked, "Daddy, why did the bad people take Grandpa's watch?" The question froze the air. Lila stared at me, startled. "I never told her about the watch," I said slowly. Our daughter blinked. "Mrs. Hale told me. She said it must be very old and shiny." Lila's fork clattered against her plate. My pulse hammered. Marjorie had spoken directly to our child, planting knowledge she should not have had. I stepped outside for air. The cul-de-sac was quiet, but her lights were on across the street. Curtains shifted, and I felt eyes on me. It was no longer suspicion. It was certainty. Someone on the HOA board had crossed a line between governance and crime, and the first thread of their secret had just unraveled in front of me. The following morning began with the low rumble of a patrol car rolling back into the neighborhood. 2 officers stepped out, crisp uniforms sharp against the lazy Florida sun. They canvassed door to door, asking if anyone had seen strange vehicles or visitors while my family was away. From my porch, I watched the performance like an unwilling audience. Every answer from my neighbors blurred together shakes of the head, muttered apologies, claims of being out of town too. When the officers reached Marjorie's house, she greeted them with the confidence of someone accustomed to speaking for the community. Arms folded, chin high. She described an unfamiliar van parked on the street 2 nights before the break-in. Yet her story didn't match what another neighbor had told the night before. Discrepancies piled like kindling. After the officers left, she crossed over to me, her perfume riding the warm air. "You know, Evan," she said, "if you had followed the board's security checklist-approved cameras, HOA-monitored alarm systems, this tragedy might have been avoided." I bit down on my response, but Lila stepped forward. Our system was fine. Someone disabled it on purpose. Marjorie's smile was thin as paper. "Then perhaps you should reconsider your stance toward community oversight. Independence has its costs." She tapped her clipboard, as if my loss were an itemized deduction. By midday, I walked the yard again, cataloging what still felt wrong. The back gate's latch was unfastened. A set of tire impressions pressed into the grass near the fence line, deep, heavy, as though from a vehicle that had no business back there. I photographed everything, tucking my phone into my pocket like contraband. That evening, the HOA board sent an email blast to all residents. Subject line: Incident Response Community Security. The message painted the burglary as an unfortunate consequence of non-compliance with board recommendations. It suggested new fees for enhanced surveillance, funded by residents. My blood heated as I read. The narrative was clear: turn my victimhood into justification for more control. Lila read over my shoulder, jaw tightening. "They're blaming us." I nodded, and cashing in on it. At dusk, a plain envelope appeared on our doorstep. No stamp, no name. Inside lay a single sheet of paper with block letters cut from magazines. "Stop searching for the box. Some things are safer lost." My hands trembled. Whoever left it had been close enough to touch our door, bold enough to taunt me. I scanned the street, nothing but trimmed lawns and shuttered windows. Yet the air carried that same expensive perfume, faint but undeniable. For the first time, I understood this wasn't just a burglary. It was a warning. And if Marjorie or her allies had risked entering my home once, there was nothing stopping them from coming back. I drove to the police station the next morning with the envelope sealed in a plastic bag. The officer at the front desk examined it, brows raised. "We'll send it to forensics, but don't expect miracles. Ransom-style letters rarely yield prints." On the drive back, unease pressed down heavier than the steering wheel. The street leading into our subdivision looked ordinary: sprinklers ticking, children biking, retirees walking dogs. But beneath that postcard calm, I felt like a target painted in the center of the cul-de-sac. When I pulled into the driveway, Marjorie was already waiting on the curb, clipboard tucked against her chest. "Evan, we need to talk about dues," she began, as if the burglary and threats were bookkeeping errors. "Now's not the time." "On the contrary," she said crisply. "Your situation has created unrest. Residents fear crime spilling into our community. The board will propose a special assessment, $500 per household, enhanced patrols, better lighting. Stability has a price." I stared at her. "So you use my family's break-in as leverage to squeeze money from everyone." Her expression didn't waver. "Responsibility rests where negligence began." "If your cameras had been positioned per HOA guidelines, perhaps this wouldn't have happened. Consider yourself fortunate we're offering solutions rather than fines." The words struck harder than the burglary itself. She wasn't offering sympathy. She was branding me the scapegoat, rewriting the narrative until my home invasion became proof of her authority. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I walked the property again. A low rustle near the hedge caught my ear. I found a small scrap of paper wedged beneath a stone. Scrawled in hurried pen, "Check the gate logs. Not everyone signs in." My pulse quickened. Our neighborhood had an electronic gate at the entrance, every entry recorded. If someone bypassed it, that would mean either insider access or tampering. Inside. I pulled up my laptop and logged into the resident portal, but the log for the week of our trip was missing, erased entirely. Every other week scrolled normally, except the one that mattered most. I leaned back, staring at the empty screen. Only the HOA board had administrator access to those records, which meant the proof of who entered during our absence had been deliberately deleted. Outside, a car door slammed. Through the blinds, I saw Marjorie talking with another board member, her hands slicing the air in sharp gestures. They glanced toward my house before walking away. The burglary hadn't just stripped my family of valuables. It was part of a larger scheme, one polished to look like governance but rotten underneath. And now I knew the board wasn't just complicit, they were orchestrating it. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after Lila and our daughter had gone to bed. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house, steady but somehow sinister. I spread my notes across the table, photos of the broken lock, sketches of the tire tracks, printouts of the HOA's mass email, and now the missing gate log. Each piece pointed in one direction. The board wasn't simply incompetent. They were hiding something. I opened the desk drawer and retrieved the notepad where I had written my original inventory of what was stolen. My eyes lingered on the line about the heirloom box. The documents inside weren't just family keepsakes. They held the one thing that had kept me from folding to the HOA's demands, the easement deed my father had fought to preserve decades ago. Without it, the HOA could claim the strip of land behind our property and push through their development plan. With it, I had legal ground to resist. Now those papers were gone, and the board was already moving to erase any trace. I tried to shake the paranoia, but the timing was too perfect. We leave for vacation, every camera destroyed, every backup erased, every gate record deleted. And Marjorie just happens to know about the silver watch. My gut screamed that this wasn't coincidence. I returned to the hallway where the safe lay toppled, kneeling. I brushed my fingers across the floor. Beneath the dust was a faint smear, almost oily. I followed it a few inches until it disappeared into the carpet fibers. Whoever had opened the safe hadn't just been careful, they had been comfortable, moving slowly, deliberately, not afraid of being caught. That meant knowledge. That meant proximity. The next morning, I called the officer handling our case. "You said it looked targeted," I reminded him. "What if the target wasn't valuables, but documents, property deeds tied to the HOA? He hesitated. "That's unusual. Burglaries are usually cash and jewelry. If you're suggesting your HOA has something to gain, you'll need more than speculation." "I'll get it," I said, though my chest tightened. Because I knew finding that proof meant putting myself against an entire board determined to silence me. Later that day, while I replaced the front door frame, Marjorie appeared again. She watched as I drove in the last screw. "Strong craftsmanship," she said. "But no lock can keep out someone determined. Best to focus on cooperation with the board. We all want peace here." I straightened. Funny. Peace doesn't usually come with missing gate records and threats on my doorstep. Her eyes sharpened. "Careful. Evan, accusations without evidence create consequences." She glanced at the new door, then at the window where my daughter's drawings were taped. Innocent and bright. "You wouldn't want this ugliness to spread to your family." The way she said it chilled me more than the break-in itself. It wasn't neighborly advice. It was a warning. That night, I lay awake beside Lila, listening to the quiet house. She whispered, "Do you think we're safe?" I didn't answer, because in that moment, safety felt like a story I could no longer tell my family without lying. And in the silence, I understood whoever had taken our documents wasn't finished. They had left us something worse than theft, an unspoken promise that if I kept digging, they would come back. The following week blurred into a cycle of forced normalcy. I went to job sites, measured lumber, checked invoices, all while a knot sat in my chest. Every time I drove past the subdivision gate, I imagined the erased log, the blank space where truth should have been. One afternoon, while sorting through the debris in my office, I found a crumpled receipt wedged between two fallen binders. It wasn't mine. The header read Lock Safe Services, Clearwater, FL. The date matched the week of our vacation. My pulse quickened as I read the itemized line Residential Deadbolt and Keypad Service paid in full by Hale and Son Property Management. Hale. Marjorie's last name. Her husband ran a small contracting company, mostly maintenance and rentals. My first thought was coincidence, but my gut told me it was the thread I'd been waiting for. That evening, I drove past the strip mall listed on the receipt. The locksmith's van was parked outside, its sides painted with faded lettering. Through the shop window, I saw a man stacking boxes. I stepped inside, receipt in hand. "I need some clarity," I said, laying it on the counter. The man squinted, then nodded. "Yeah, that was a rush job. Client insisted we replace a keypad and disable the alarm before new tenants moved in. Odd request, but they paid cash and used that company card for the balance. Hale and Son." My throat dried. "Which house?" He hesitated. "Sorry, can't disclose addresses. Privacy policy." I leaned closer. That was my house. I came home to find my safe broken open and cameras smashed. Whoever ordered this set it up. His eyes widened. "Look, I don't want trouble. I just did what the client asked. They said they owned the place." I left with his words ringing in my ears. Someone had impersonated me or claimed authority they didn't have. And the payment trail led straight to Marjorie's household. When I pulled into my driveway, a shadow moved near the hedges. My neighbor's teenage son, Jason, stepped out, nervously glancing around. "Mr. Cole," he whispered, "I saw something the night before you came back. I wasn't supposed to be out, but there was a black SUV parked near your yard. I saw Mrs. Hale's silhouette. She got out, looked around, then went back in the car when another vehicle drove by." The air turned heavy. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was testimony. I thanked him, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "You didn't see this. You didn't say this." I told him, though my mind was already racing ahead. Witnesses, paper trails. This was building into something I could no longer ignore. Inside. I gathered my notes, the receipt, and Jason's words. The box wasn't stolen for money. It was stolen because inside lay proof of the HOA's illegal land grab. And now I knew Marjorie's family had orchestrated the break-in. But as I set the evidence down, I noticed the curtains across the street shift again. She was watching, always watching, and I realized with a chill that evidence alone might not be enough because she wasn't just covering tracks. She was prepared to erase anyone who threatened to expose her. The next morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps on gravel outside my window. My heart raced as I pulled back the blinds, only to see two men in identical polos and reflective vests pacing the sidewalk with clipboards. Their shirts bore no company logo, and their inspection felt more staged than official. One of them snapped photos of my yard. The other scribbled furiously, pausing to glance at the house numbers. I stepped out onto the porch. "Can I help you?" The taller one lifted his chin. "Routine, HOA inspection." His voice was clipped, practiced. "Funny," I said. "The HOA doesn't schedule inspections without notice." The man didn't blink. We're authorized. Property compliance. I pulled out my phone and started filming. The shorter man muttered, "Let's go." And they hurried down the street, sliding into a dark SUV that had been idling 2 houses away. My camera caught the license plate before they peeled off. Lila came to the doorway, pale. They just walked around like they owned the place. "That's the point," I said grimly. "They want us rattled." Later that day, I ran the plate number through a contact of mine, a supplier who moonlighted as a tow operator. He called back with the record the vehicle was registered to Hale & Son Property Management. Again, the trail led straight to Marjorie's household. That evening, while we ate dinner, a sharp knock rattled the door. I opened it to find Marjorie herself, clipboard in hand, flanked by the same 2 men I'd seen earlier. "Evan," she said smoothly, "the board has concerns about your property maintenance. Overgrown hedges, unsecured perimeter, negligence invites crime. We'll be issuing fines." My blood surged. "You send people to trespass on my lawn, then fine me for it." She didn't flinch. "The community thrives on order. Disorder cannot be tolerated." Her gaze slid toward my daughter, visible at the table behind me. "Families are safest when residents cooperate." It wasn't an observation. It was a threat dressed as policy. I slammed the door before she could say more. Lila gripped my arm. "She's escalating." What if she tries something worse? I spread the receipts, the plate record, and Jason's statement across the table. Then we build our case, piece by piece. She's leaving tracks, and eventually she'll trip over them. But deep down, I knew Marjorie wasn't the type to trip. She was the type to strike first. And the more evidence I gathered, the more dangerous her desperation would become. I spent the next 2 days assembling everything into a folder: the locksmith's receipt, the fake inspection video, the plate registration, Jason's statement. Each piece on its own could be dismissed as circumstantial, but together they painted a picture too sharp to ignore. On the third night, while Lila tucked our daughter into bed, I spread the documents across the kitchen table. The hum of the overhead light felt like interrogation. My phone buzzed a blocked number. Against my better judgment, I answered. A distorted voice rasped, "Stop digging. Evan, you don't know what you're walking into." Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone until my reflection blurred in the black screen. My gut clenched. Not just from fear, but from certainty. The board knew exactly how close I was getting. Sleep wouldn't come. At midnight, I returned to my office, flipping through scanned files I had nearly forgotten. Buried in an old project folder was a digital copy of the easement deed I thought I'd lost forever. The scan wasn't notarized, but it was legible and damning. It showed the property line exactly as my father had defended it, disproving the HOA's claim to the strip of land. Adrenaline surged. Even without the original, this copy could expose their fraud. I printed it, slid it into the folder, and locked it in a metal case under my desk. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. At the coffee shop by the highway, I met with 2 other homeowners I trusted. I showed them the erased gate log screenshot and hinted at what I'd uncovered. Their reactions were identical: shock first, then anger. One leaned closer. "Evan, if what you're saying is true, the board's been stealing from us for years." Word spread faster than I intended. By evening, I noticed more neighbors pausing at my driveway, asking questions they wouldn't have dared a week earlier. And from across the street, Marjorie watched each exchange like a hawk circling prey. That night, a brick crashed through our front window. Lila screamed as I rushed to the living room. Shards glittered across the carpet, and tied to the brick was a single note scrawled in red marker. "This ends now." I froze, the note trembling in my hands. The burglary had been violation enough, but this was war declared in plain sight. And in that moment, I knew 2 things with absolute clarity. The HOA wasn't simply trying to silence me. They were willing to destroy everything I had to keep their secret buried. And unless I fought back, they would succeed. The morning after the brick shattered our window, I stood barefoot among the shards, staring at the note that still lay on the coffee table. This ends now. Lila swept the glass into a dustpan with trembling hands while our daughter clung to her hip, eyes wide and unblinking. I wanted to promise them safety, but the words caught in my throat. The enemy wasn't some faceless burglar anymore. It was our own HOA, led by a neighbor who had crossed the line from authority into criminality. By mid-afternoon, I had boarded the window with plywood and called a locksmith I trusted, not one tied to Hale and Son. He reinforced the new doorframe and installed a fresh deadbolt. But even as he worked, I felt the hollowness of the gesture. Locks didn't matter when the people who broke them believed they owned the neighborhood. That evening, I sat with the folder of evidence spread across the table again, the locksmith's receipt with Hale and Son's name, Jason's testimony about the SUV, the video of the fake inspectors, the erased gate logs, the threatening notes. It wasn't enough to convict, but it was enough to expose, and exposure was the only weapon I had. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Friday in the clubhouse. I decided I wouldn't wait for investigators who moved at the speed of molasses. I would put everything on the table, in front of the community. Force Marjorie into the light where her charm and clipped authority couldn't hide behind email blasts. On Friday night, the clubhouse filled with residents, folding chairs scraping across linoleum. The air carried the stale mix of coffee and frustration. I sat in the second row with the metal case locked at my feet, every muscle taut. Lila squeezed my hand but said nothing. Marjorie entered last, clipboard in hand, pearls at her throat like armor. She tapped the microphone with a manicured nail and began her practiced greeting. Welcome. Neighbors. Tonight's agenda includes discussion of increased security measures, proposed assessments, and I rose before she could continue. My voice carried sharper than I intended. Before you raise fees and point fingers, I think everyone here deserves the truth about what's been happening in this neighborhood. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marjorie's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. Evan, please sit. You'll have time for resident comments. No, I said, unlocking the case and laying the first document on the table. This isn't a comment. This is evidence. Gasps fluttered as I held up the locksmith's receipt, reading aloud Hale and Son's payment for a keypad service the week we were away. I showed the video clip of the two so-called inspectors trespassing in my yard, the SUV plate linking back to the same company. Then I produced Jason's written statement. The room shifted, neighbors leaning forward, whispers colliding. For the first time, doubt flickered across faces that once followed Marjorie without question. Marjorie's voice sliced through the noise. Baseless. Anyone can forge receipts. Anyone can stage videos. Evan has suffered a tragedy, but grief makes people reckless. I met her gaze. Then how do you explain the missing gate logs? Only the board has administrator access. And why did someone throw a brick through my window with a threat tied to it? My family has lived here for 10 years. We never had problems until I started pushing back against your land claim. The murmurs swelled into outrage. A man in the back shouted, "Is this true? Did the board erase records?" Others chimed in, anger bubbling where fear had been. Marjorie slammed her clipboard onto the podium. Enough. This meeting is for official business, not conspiracy theories, but her voice cracked, and that tiny fracture spread through the room like a fault line. Residents who once nodded at her every word now glared with suspicion, and as the tension reached a boil, the clubhouse doors swung open. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, scanning the crowd. One of them held a folder. I recognized the evidence I had turned over days earlier. Marjorie froze, her carefully curated poise faltering for the first time. The officers stepped forward, their presence silencing the room more effectively than any gavel. One held up a hand. We've received credible information regarding criminal activity tied to this community's leadership. We're here to ask some questions. Every eye shifted to Marjorie. Her pearls gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but the color drained from her face. She drew herself taller, trying to summon authority. This is highly irregular. If you have questions for me, they should be handled privately, not in front of my neighbors. The taller officer shook his head. Transparency matters here. Several residents have come forward, and evidence has been submitted that connects your family's company to unlawful entry on private property. Gasps erupted. Marjorie tried to laugh, brittle and sharp. Evidence, from Evan Cole. He's been obsessed since the burglary. He would forge anything to smear me because he can't accept responsibility for his own carelessness. I stood. Carelessness doesn't explain your husband's company paying for locksmith services at my house while I was out of the country. It doesn't explain two of your so-called inspectors trespassing in my yard. And it doesn't explain why you knew about my father's silver watch before anyone else did. Her eyes flicked toward me, venom in every blink. You're twisting coincidence into conspiracy. Neighbors shouted over each other. Answer the question, Marjorie, one woman yelled. Where's the HOA money gone? Another demanded. The room vibrated with outrage, years of frustration suddenly finding a target. The shorter officer stepped forward. We've also obtained financial records through subpoenas. There are discrepancies in the HOA accounts, large transfers to shell companies linked to Hale & Son Property Management. The outcry turned into a roar. Residents stood, pointing, demanding answers. Chairs scraped back, voices cracked with fury. Marjorie slammed her clipboard against the podium again, but her words drowned in the tidal wave of dissent. Finally, she snapped. You all think you know so much. You wouldn't have your manicured lawns, your painted curbs, your perfect property values without me. I built this neighborhood. I kept it orderly. And if I took something in return, it was nothing compared to what you owed me. The room fell silent for a beat, stunned by her outburst. Then the silence broke into chaos. Neighbors shouting, some recording on their phones, others storming toward the front. The officers quickly moved between her and the crowd, voices firm. Step back. Everyone, let us handle this. Marjorie's mask had cracked wide open. The treasurer, the enforcer, the woman who dictated hedge heights and mailbox colors, had just admitted to stealing from the very people she lorded over. I caught Lila's hand, squeezing it hard. For the first time since returning from our vacation, I felt the tide turning. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Cornered animals didn't surrender quietly, and judging by the fire blazing in Marjorie's eyes, she was about to show everyone just how vicious she could become. The room teetered on the edge of riot. Half the residents shouted for Marjorie's resignation. Others demanded she be arrested on the spot. The officers tried to calm the crowd, but their words drowned in the storm of anger. Marjorie stood rigid at the podium, face flushed crimson, her clipboard trembling in her grip. You're all ungrateful, she shrieked, voice cracking through the noise. Every flower bed, every freshly painted curb, those were my standards. Without me, this place would fall apart like every other rundown neighborhood in Florida. Her words only fanned the flames. Someone yelled, "We're not paying you to play dictator." Another shouted, "You robbed us." Cell phones rose like torches, recording every second. Marjorie's eyes darted wildly, searching for control she no longer had. Then, in a final, desperate act, she slammed the microphone aside and pointed at me. "This is your fault. Evan, you stirred them up with lies and forged papers. You think you're some hero, but you're just a bitter man who couldn't follow the rules." The officers moved toward her, but she shoved the podium into their path and lunged toward me. Gasps rippled as she grabbed the folder of evidence from the table, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. "You won't destroy me with this," she hissed. I stepped back, heart pounding, but before she could retreat, a neighbor blocked the exit, phone camera raised. Others closed in, hemming her inside the circle of folding chairs. The officers seized her arms, but she kicked and spat, screaming accusations at everyone in reach. From her bag, papers spilled across the floor, bank statements, falsified invoices, HOA checks made out to shell companies. Residents snatched them up, holding them high for all to see. Proof, undeniable and raw, lay scattered at our feet. Marjorie's voice broke into sobs, then rage, then guttural denial. "You don't understand. I kept this place alive. I deserve every cent." The taller officer tightened his grip on her wrists. "You're under arrest for suspected embezzlement, fraud, and breaking and entering. You have the right to remain silent." Her scream echoed through the clubhouse as they pulled her toward the door, fighting every step. Residents surged forward, shouting, some in triumph, others in disbelief. Lila clutched my hand, tears welling in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of release. As the door slammed shut behind Marjorie and the officers, the room erupted not in chaos this time, but in a wave of voices rising together. Neighbors hugged, others vented years of pent-up resentment, and a few simply stood stunned, realizing the woman who had ruled their lives with iron bylaws was nothing more than a thief in pearls. I sank into my chair, chest heaving. For the first time in weeks, the weight pressing on my shoulders began to lift. But beneath the relief, a question lingered if Marjorie had been bold enough to rob my home and manipulate an entire neighborhood. Who else had helped her? And more importantly, were they still out there, watching, waiting to finish what she started? The days after Marjorie's arrest felt unreal, as if the neighborhood had shed its skin overnight. For years, she had dictated the color of shutters and the height of hedges, her word treated as law. Now, her house sat dark, blinds drawn, a patrol car parked outside to keep gawkers at bay. Children rode bikes past it in silence, as though the walls themselves carried a warning. Inside my home, the tension slowly loosened. The window was repaired, the door reinforced, but the true repair came from knowing the truth was no longer mine alone. My neighbors had seen her outburst, her desperate confession, the evidence spilling from her bag. They had watched the police lead her out in handcuffs. No HOA memo could rewrite what their own eyes had witnessed. Still, the damage lingered. Lila jumped at every knock. Our daughter asked nightly if the bad lady would come back. I reassured them, though part of me remained restless, because Marjorie hadn't acted alone. Hale and Son Property Management didn't forge receipts by themselves. Money didn't move into shell accounts without signatures. There were others who had dipped their hands into the same pot. 2 days later, the police called me to the station. A detective spread documents across the table: bank transfers, vendor contracts, inspection invoices. "Your evidence gave us leverage," he said. She cracked when we pressed her. Turns out, it wasn't just embezzlement. Funds were laundered through multiple companies. Some board members signed off without asking questions or chose not to. My chest tightened, so the board knew some did. Some turned a blind eye. Either way, the HOA's finances are under full audit now. Residents will have the right to elect an entirely new board. Relief and fury warred inside me. Relief that the system was catching up to them. Fury that it had taken my family's violation, our stolen heirlooms, to spark it. I asked about the wooden box and the watch, the personal pieces that still haunted me. The detective shook his head. "We've recovered financial records, but personal items often disappear into pawn shops. We'll keep looking." That night, I sat at my desk, the copy of my father's easement deed lit by the lamp's glow. It wasn't the original, but it was enough to challenge the HOA's land grab in court, enough to honor the fight my father had started. Neighbors began stopping by, not with casseroles this time, but with questions. How could we rebuild trust? Could we sue to recover the stolen funds? What would happen to property values now that the scandal had broken for the first time? They weren't looking at me with suspicion. They were looking at me for leadership. I hadn't asked for that role. I hadn't wanted it. But as I watched them gather in my living room, voices overlapping with determination instead of fear, I realized the HOA's grip had cracked wide open, and in that space, something new was beginning to take root. Yet in quiet moments, when the house was still, I couldn't shake the image of Marjorie's eyes as the officers dragged her away, burning not with defeat, but with the promise of unfinished vengeance. Within a week, the neighborhood transformed from quiet suspicion into open rebellion. Yard signs appeared overnight: "Reclaim our community, audit the board now." The same neighbors who once whispered compliance now spoke loudly in driveways and on social media. One evening, I joined a gathering in the cul-de-sac. Folding chairs lined the asphalt, flashlights beaming like campfires. Residents passed around copies of the leaked financial records, shaking their heads in disbelief. "She drained tens of thousands from us," one man muttered, "and we just let her." A woman raised her voice. "We paid for playground upgrades that never happened. We paid for a security contract with a company that doesn't exist." Where did it all go? I told them what the detective had explained: shell accounts, kickbacks, property management invoices routed through hail and sun. Every revelation deepened the outrage. But something else grew alongside it: unity. For the first time in years, we weren't afraid of the board. We were angry enough to dismantle it. The following weekend, a town hall meeting was held at the community center, this time without the HOA's banner overhead. More than 50 residents crowded inside, voices echoing off the high ceilings. Lila sat beside me, her hand warm against mine. A retired teacher stood and said, "We need to dissolve this board, elect a temporary committee, and demand restitution." Applause thundered. Another neighbor added, "Evan has been fighting them from the start. He's the reason this came to light. I nominate him for interim chair." The room turned toward me. Heat rushed to my face. I shook my head. "I'm no politician. I'm just a man who wanted his family safe." "But that's exactly why." Someone replied, "We need leadership that doesn't see power as a prize. We need someone who's already proven he'll stand up." Their voices rose in agreement, a chorus of trust I hadn't expected. For so long, I had felt isolated, targeted, watched. Now, my neighbors looked at me not with suspicion, but with solidarity. I finally nodded. "If you want me to help rebuild, I will. But this isn't about me. This is about all of us making sure no one person ever holds this much control again." Cheers filled the room. For the first time, the community felt like ours, not hers. That night, walking home beneath the quiet glow of porch lights, I glanced at Marjorie's darkened house. Police tapes still fluttered across the front door. I thought of the wooden box, my father's watch, the pieces of my past she had stolen and likely destroyed. Those losses still cut deep. But in their place, something stronger had been built: a neighborhood no longer ruled by fear, but bound together by the truth. And though I knew battles lay ahead, court hearings, audits, the slow grind of justice, I felt a resolve settle into my bones. For once, I wasn't standing alone against the board. I was standing with my community, and together we would see this through. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood adjusted to its new rhythm. Police cars no longer circled the cul-de-sac, but their absence didn't erase the unease that lingered in every porch light and locked door. Marjorie and her husband remained in county custody, facing charges that piled higher with each audit: fraud, embezzlement, falsified contracts, and the burglary that had started it all. I attended every hearing, sitting quietly in the back as prosecutors unveiled the paper trail I had first uncovered. Each time the judge read another charge, Marjorie's face hardened. The pearls she once wore traded for a plain orange jumpsuit, yet her eyes never dulled. When she glanced toward the gallery, I felt her stare sharpen like broken glass aimed at me. Back home, life slowly regained its rhythm. Lila replanted the flower beds she had abandoned during the worst weeks. Our daughter rode her bike again without glancing over her shoulder. Neighbors stopped by not with suspicion, but with baked bread, warm greetings, and genuine thanks. What had begun as isolation turned into connection? Still, some losses couldn't be replaced. The wooden box never resurfaced. Neither did my father's watch. Those pieces of history remained stolen, swallowed by greed. At night, I sometimes sat at my desk, running my fingers over the faded scan of the easement deed, imagining the original pages burned or buried somewhere I'd never find. But then I looked out the window at the rows of houses, at the people who had once bowed to Marjorie's every word and now stood shoulder to shoulder in defiance. I realized the box was more than wood and paper. It was legacy, and legacy, once defended, could live beyond the object itself. When the neighborhood gathered to vote in a new board, the energy felt different. No fear, no posturing, just ordinary people determined to keep each other honest. They asked me to take the chair officially, but I declined. I'll advise, I told them, but I won't become what we just tore down. Power belongs to the community, not one person. Applause followed, and I saw relief in their faces. The HOA would survive, but as something new, stripped of tyranny. That night, as I tucked my daughter into bed, she asked, "Are the bad people gone for good?" I hesitated, then kissed her forehead. "They're gone," I said. But in my mind, I added for now, because corruption doesn't vanish. It waits for cracks to seep back through. Standing by the window, I thought of the journey from returning home to a broken door, to standing before my neighbors with proof of betrayal, to watching justice finally catch up. We had won, yes, but the real victory wasn't Marjorie in handcuffs. It was a community waking up, choosing to protect itself. And as the streetlights hummed and the night deepened, a question lingered, heavy but necessary. If those entrusted to guard our homes can so easily become the ones who violate them, how do we ever decide who deserves our trust again?